Let's look at the second major issue here, which is how do I improve my composition? Now, again, this is a tricky one because I feel like the word composition means, different things to different people. I feel like this is less about, theory and studies and the idea part of it, although I think that is, it can be useful. But really, I think this is about developing your ability to plan images, training your eye, and a lot of the actual practical way you would do that is by developing your sort of skills with thumbnailing, right? Which is essentially where we're planning what the image looks like and, planning the composition of the image. Now, I feel like I got some of these things, right when I was starting out, and I also got some of them wrong. And what I want to do is, again, share with you my thoughts and, general ideas and some practical tips for how you can improve this area and ultimately, again, improve your composition and your ability to create images that look good, right? Because I think at the end of the day, that's what composition means. The first thing I want to touch on is the idea that I sort of alluded to, which is my opinion is that the studies and the rules are less valuable compared to essentially just simple practice, right? And a lot of what we're trying to do when we make up rules that sort of tell us how to make good images is we're really trying to verbalize something that is a non-verbal skill. And, I think if people had a bunch of rules that, made, images automatically really good, then everyone would be really good at this. And people aren't, right? And I know a lot of people who, I've met a lot of people who understand all these things and they still really struggle to implement, right? So, you can know as many of these compositional rules as you want. It's not really going to change your ability to make an amazing image. And I think often rules are really good to stop us from making terrible images, but they're really at the core of, making the type of images that I think will stand the test of time. And the other thing is often what you'll find is rules are very medium and genre specific. They're very much linked to how your particular style and medium of creating art works. And I don't think they always cross-pollinate well. I think you just have to be sort of mindful of that and just really structure your development of composition around training your eye to, again, sort of, look at the world and understand other pictures and how they're built. And again, train your ability to plan how you're actually going to make your images, not sort of looking at how other people necessarily made theirs, all the time, right? You have to spend most of your time actually planning yours, a little bit of time studying the images you like, and I'd say very little time studying images that you kind of don't like. Again, I feel like that's basically the main point. I think if you do want to train your eye, if you want to sort of deal with, again, an abstract exercise, and by an abstract exercise, I just mean an exercise where you're not actually creating art. The best one, the simplest one, is to take a set number of photos each day. We've all got quite good, camera phones these days, and I think they're only going to get better. And that's actually a really good way to, look at the world through a lens, look at a frame. You can manipulate it. You can see it in sort of real time and sort of plan and modify compositions. You can potentially edit the photos. And again, develop your eye that way, right? I mean, I think that's the simplest, best, most effective way to get better at kind of making good choices, which I think is at the core of composition, as opposed to a lot of the other stuff, right? Which again, I feel like the further we get away from just actually practicing making images and just continually trying to make them better and better, the worse it gets. And I think if you want to do that, again, camera phone is the best option, right? It's actually kind of sort of magical. I think it's one of these things where it's like it provides us such value there But because it's so commonplace, I feel like people don't really appreciate how good that is as a simple tool. So I do want to expand on this idea of what I mean by a thumbnail and sort of how it can help us. A thumbnail is really just a small drawing that we use to plan the larger drawing. And historically, I think they existed for the very sort of simple reason that you would never just sort of attempt to waste a whole bunch of paint and canvas painting something that you kind of hadn't planned. That's just sort of not how it worked. There was no ability to practice, just by kind of slopping paint around. That sort of only became possible as paint and materials became cheaper and cheaper. And again, now that digital art is here, again, it is really possible to kind of just develop all sorts of processes. And a lot of those sort of don't need thumbnails, right? You can sort of, start here and end up there and, create things that I feel like actually are very interesting and very, creative. But I don't think they're really going to necessarily help you to create, again, highly polished illustrations of the sort of type that I'm talking about, where we have to sort of plan them. And again, we're sort of often aiming to do this in a professional sense, or at least, have people involved in our process. So, I think for our purposes, it's really important to build that sort of thumbnailing ability. And, I think that will really help us in so many ways, because I think it helps us to, again, explore the ideas of composition. It's the kind of thing you can sort of do anywhere. You can do it in a sketchbook. You can do it anywhere. You can do it in a cafe. There's very little commitment because you're just playing around with it. And I feel like once you start creating a lot of thumbnails, you will start to look at pictures and the world a little bit differently, and you can sort of start to, again, source ideas from the world and look at stuff there. And again, you can, just sort of play around and sketch around, again, wherever, right? It's anytime an idea hits you, you can kind of try and sort of, jot it down, right? So again, I feel like at core, it's a very creative act. But again, it's just drawing small. And that's really the trick here is I feel like, often people sort of imagine that, if you can draw big, then you can draw small. And that's just not the case, right? It is a very sort of different skill to be able to represent the world and plan your particular type of imagery and what you need to support the next step in your process. It will take skill and time to develop that, both as a process and just from a really practical standpoint, right? Like, if we look at these are all sort of done for a sort of a video game, and they're basically planning out different areas of action and narrative and sort of story and all sorts of different things. There's all sorts of different purposes these would have, and some of them, we did multiple iterations on the idea. Some, it was just kind of like, they just sort of said, like, let's come up with a bunch of ideas for sort of action scenes. What would that look like? And that's why, a lot of these kind of have that kind of sort of third-person camera look to some of them. But again, the basic idea is, if you just kind of think about, the fact that drawing small is different, we are focusing on sort of bigger shapes, and you kind of have to relearn everything. How do you draw a rock small? How do you draw a hand small? How do you rough in the figure small? How much detail do you put in? How do you draw a tree? How do you draw leaves? How do you draw sky? How do you draw clouds? It is a task, right? And you do have to put some time into it because this is personal. Right? This is about you and how you plan your images. Now, you need to be able to sort of, show your thumbnails and, sort of share it, right? So it's not like, it's not personal in the way that no one else sees it, but it is personal in the way that what you're trying to do here is take what's in your imagination and sort of transfer it to the real world, right? This is where your ideas really sort of meet the page. And so you kind of have to, figure out what do you need there, what's important for you, and to develop your particular thumbnailing style and, the size that you do it and all of those things. It can take you a while, right? So please don't think of it as like, I'm doing thumbnails and, you kind of try drawing small once and it's like, that's really not for me. Like, no, this is a specific skill you sort of build and work on, right? And it's very different from everything else. But yeah, you can actually see these ones I think were done in a sketchbook, right? I think some of them maybe, or some parts of them look like they were sort of done, yeah, sort of in a sketchbook and sort of scanned in and worked in. So again, that's one of the most fun things about it as well, is it allows you to sort of, again, explore ideas, at any stage. But yeah, if you sort of look at these again, these are quite elaborate thumbnails is what I would sort of consider. I've sort of considered the perspective and, how we're going to sort of view the world. And there for some of these, there might have been a couple of sort of rougher thumbnails before this, right? Before we sort of clarified this. And they're exploring the basic compositional ideas of foreground, middle ground, background. They're quite simple images. So I'm really sort of, making sure that, again, the major things there that we want to pay attention to are, quite big. The main story point there is quite sort of, simple. But again, the key here is understanding that your thumbnail is what you need to get to the next stage. And you need to understand, again, what you're planning for, right? So again, this will take a while. Don't freak out if you try this and it doesn't automatically work, right? It will take you a while. And I sort of always did thumbnails, and the problem I had, right, was not that I sort of couldn't do good thumbnails. It's that I had no idea how to turn that thumbnail into anything else, right? So that is really something else that's key here. Is you still need to sort of complete your creation cycle, right? You can't spend your whole life doing thumbnails because you sort of have no ability to turn them into something. And it's really that creation loop that allows you to understand how your plan will kind of turn into something in the end, right? So again, some practical suggestions that I can sort of give you that might sort of help you actually get into this and start to develop your thumbnailing, besides the just sort of do a lot of it, right? Is that, really what you want to do is try and spark that sense of creativity and use this as a place for exploration and a place where you can play with the composition, right? Because once you get to play with it and you understand how your thumbnail relates to your sort of finish, you can sort of iterate a lot quicker and you can play with composition a lot quicker. And I think that's where, again, you're really just going to train your eye and, develop your ability to plan interesting compositions, right? And you can also look at other great artists who, do have a really big sort of thumbnailing element to their process and sort of see how they handle that. But yeah, if we sort of look at some thumbnailing sort of things, there's a couple of sort of ideas that I think are really sort of good to play with here. One is that I think it's really useful if you are sort of starting thumbnailing to set yourself a specific number of thumbnails to do, right? So I feel like often those tasks will inspire our creativity as opposed to, like make it sort of, sort of too technical and stiff. I feel like people will start that way. Like most students who I sort of give a task of like draw 20 thumbnails for a particular illustration, after about 5, I'm not their best friend, right? Because after 5, you're kind of like, oh man, I'm out of ideas. But that's often when the magic happens, right? When we sort of sit down and have that experience of, being like, I don't have any ideas. I've sort of done the major things that I think I could do for this particular thumbnail. Again, these images here are from a big sort of tutorial I did where I sort of go over that sort of process and, sort of go through the ideation phase of sort of how I would come up with an idea. But yeah, that idea of sort of again, getting to the point where you've got those those 5 thumbnails and you're sort of out of ideas. That's when we sort of start to come up with new and interesting ideas, right? You sort of scrape the bottom of the barrel and you're like, okay, what's next? Okay, I don't care about this anymore. This is a stupid exercise. I'm just going to do something ridiculous, right? And I feel like it's that process of getting to the point of like, whatever, let's just do something that, often really interesting results happen at that stage. And that's when you can be more abstract in the way you could sort of give yourself challenges like, oh, let's try 5 of them that are like this, or let's, try and make them like this type of image that I've seen, right? You get more creative because you sort of have to. So again, it is really important, as I said, to complete the creation cycle. You're not going to get any benefit from just doing thumbnails. You do need to go through, because that's what will really train you and teach you how those thumbnailing choices you're making are going to sort of turn out in the end, right? And again, like that's the number one thing I sort of messed up, right? So I'd really recommend, again, do a whole bunch of thumbnails, but also make sure you're regularly, going through that sort of process as well. And again, if the idea of doing a set number of thumbnails is potentially, too challenging, or just is too much time, you can set a specific amount of time. So, you can maybe say, I'm going to spend 30 minutes on thumbnailing, or 20 minutes on thumbnailing, whatever it is, an hour on thumbnailing, 2 hours on thumbnailing. Again, I often find if I'm doing one of these demos or something, it's often like a 2 or 3 hour process, but that's because I'm sort of talking through the process, you know what I mean? And I'm sort of trying to explain what I'm doing a bit more. But a really good rule of thumb you can use is to set the amount of time you plan an image as a percentage of your estimated time, overall that you're going to spend on that image. And I feel like a 5 to 10% sort of range is really good. So as an example, if you're going to spend an hour doing like, a sketchy sort of, like image, or you're just going to do sort of like a, something that's, just like a face or whatever, and that's going to take you an hour, spend like 6 minutes, spend like 5 minutes or something like that, just thumbnailing out some ideas, thinking about what angle you're going to choose. Is the face going to be light or dark on a light or dark background? Are you going to add any abstract elements? How are you going to plan the background? And get into the habit of kind of formalizing the planning of it. That will kind of really help, right? So conversely, if you're sort of going to spend 20 hours on an image, that means that you're going to need to spend what would that be? It's at least, again, 1 or 2 hours of sort of full time working on the plan for that image, right? And I find that sort of percentage always it will set you up well, right? So always think about that. And I really, sometimes you can take that to the extreme. You don't have to just thumbnail like like illustrations that have multiple elements and stuff. You can thumbnail out just little character sketches, or just get in the habit of sort of thumbnailing out everything you're doing and creating small versions of stuff, and drawing small as a way to ideate. Because again, the more time you spend doing that, the more creative you'll feel, right? The more used to it you get. But again, in the end, those are the key things I really think will sort of help, right? It's just understanding that firstly, rules and, the studies and the sort of more formalized ways that I feel like people tend to teach composition, I haven't found them very useful. I think it's really just about training your eye. And I think the best way to do that is by looking at a bunch of cool images. Maybe, again, get into photography. That's a super cheap, effective, easy way to do it these days. But really it's just about practicing the compositional stage, which is the thumbnail stage, right? Like that's going to make the most difference. The second is, it's just drawing small, right? So remember, don't expect yourself to be able to just naturally do this. This is a skill. But it really is just you planning things by doing a small version of your finished image, right? You don't need to think about it in any other way than that. And how you start, whether you start sketchy or specific, or whether you need to plan, like whatever you need to do, maybe look at, again, your favorite artists and how they do it. But, whatever crazy way you figure out to do it, that's fine, because this is a really personal process, okay? You end up with a thumbnail that you can maybe share with an art director or something, but how you get there in that ideation phase, again, you can sort of see, all the random sort of stuff I did, and some are finished and some are more finished. Like that's really personal, and, you don't have to necessarily plan to share that, right? That can happen however you want, right? As long as you come up with a plan that you can share with someone at the end. So, again, it's just drawing small. And again, just practical suggestions that you can use is draw a set number, make sure you spend, a set amount of time doing this. That'll kind of inspire creativity. And, if you are just, trying to come up with a rough little sketch. You can, like, oh man, I've just got 5 minutes. Okay, let's just come up with a few ideas. What am I going to draw? Okay, let's plan it out. Again, that's not the only way to draw. That's not necessarily the best way to draw, but it will help you practice the idea of drawing small and then transferring that small drawing, throughout your process. But again, it's a personal thing, right? And you need to understand essentially how to plan the images you want. And I think once you start building images regularly from the thumbnail, I really think you'll be better able to draw from the world and plan good compositions. This really is the key, is once you get into that process and you start thinking about, like, how is a picture built? How do we move the eye through, and you planned it one way and then you saw the result. I feel like once we're actually living that lifestyle, right, of being people who create imagery, and you're thinking about the fact that it is planned, it doesn't just kind of happen, then you'll be able to look at movies, you'll be able to look at other imagery, and you sort of understand how it's put together, right? The fact that these, rarely are these choices made, just by accident or by themselves. All these things are placed there, right? All of these lights are placed there. All of these elements are placed there, right? So that, the viewer can engage with that material. So anyway, I really think that's the key to it all. I don't think it's more complicated than just practice drawing small. Again, thanks for hanging out. Thanks for listening to my thoughts on this. Let me know if you got any questions. In the next video, we'll deal with the next question. And I'll give you a few tips and thoughts, again, very similar to this, about how you can improve that area of illustration. See you there.